You know what frustrated me for years in my shop? I'd pick out what I thought was a beautiful board, spend a whole weekend building something with it, and 3 months later, it would twist, crack, or pull apart at the joints. And I couldn't figure out what I was doing wrong. I was measuring carefully, cutting accurately, using good glue and good fasteners, but the wood kept fighting me. Then I started reading about medieval European carpenters, the men who built the great timber frame halls and cathedral roofs that are still standing after 700 or 800 years. And I realized something humbling. Those craftsmen didn't have table saws or thickness planers or moisture meters, but they understood wood in ways that most of us, myself included, never learned. Today I'm going to walk you through 10 things those medieval carpenters knew about wood that most modern DIYers have completely lost touch with. And stick around to the end because I'll share a layout technique I picked up from studying medieval timber framing that changed how I mark joints in my own shop. Let's get into it. Medieval carpentry across England, France, and Germany, from roughly the 11th through the 15th century, represents one of the most practical and well-tested building traditions in history. These weren't artists working in studios. These were working tradesmen solving real structural problems with hand tools, green timber, and an understanding of wood that was passed down through generations of apprenticeship. What makes their knowledge worth studying today is simple. Their work survived. We can walk into a barn in Suffolk, England that was framed in 1300, and the joints are still tight. The roof structure of Notre Dame before the fire had timbers that were cut in the 12th century, and they were still doing their job. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because those men understood how wood behaves over time, how it moves, how it shrinks, how it wants to settle, and they designed every joint and every selection of timber around that understanding. There's a principle that runs through all of medieval carpentry, and it's this: you don't force wood into what you want it to be. You learn what it wants to do, and you use that. Every single method I'm about to share comes back to that idea. The first thing medieval carpenters knew that most of us have forgotten is the difference between riven wood and sawn wood. Today, when we need a board, we go to the lumberyard and buy something that was flat sawn or quarter sawn on a bandsaw or circular saw. It's convenient and it's fast. But medieval carpenters didn't saw their stock unless they absolutely had to. They rived it, which means they split it along the natural grain using wedges and a froe. Here's why that matters so much. When you saw through a board, the blade doesn't care about grain direction. It cuts straight regardless of where the fibers are running. So you end up with boards that have grain running off the edge, what we call short grain or runout. That's where cracks start. That's where wood fails. But when you rive a log, the split follows the grain naturally. Every fiber runs continuously from one end of the board to the other. The result is a piece of wood that is dramatically stronger, more stable, and more predictable than anything you'll pull off a stack at the lumberyard. I started riving some white oak a few years back using a froe and a couple of steel wedges, and the difference in the resulting stock genuinely surprised me. The boards were tougher, more resistant to splitting at the ends, and they moved less as they dried. Medieval carpenters knew that a riven piece of oak 6 inches wide could outperform a sawn piece 8 inches wide because the integrity of the grain makes up for the difference in dimension. The second thing they understood was how to read a tree before they ever felled it. Modern DIYers, myself included for most of my life, pick wood based on how it looks at the lumberyard. Color, figure, maybe we check for obvious defects. But a medieval carpenter chose his timber while it was still standing. He would look at how the tree grew, whether it leaned, whether it had a twist in the trunk, where the branches started, and how the roots flared at the base. A tree that grew leaning to one side develops what's called reaction wood, compression wood in softwoods, tension wood in hardwoods. That reaction wood is unstable. It moves unpredictably when you work it. Medieval carpenters could spot this in a living tree, and they would either avoid it or, and this is the clever part, they would use that built-in tension strategically. They'd place a timber with a natural curve where the structure needed a curved brace. They weren't fighting the wood. They were reading it and letting it do what it already wanted to do. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these old-world methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called The Lost Workshop, and it is a complete guide to hand tool woodworking the way medieval craftsmen actually did it. 156 pages, 17 chapters, 33 illustrations. Techniques like the ones we are covering today, and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. The third thing medieval carpenters understood was green wood joinery, and this is one that really changed my thinking. Most of us today are taught to only work with kiln-dried lumber. Get it down to 6 to 8% moisture content, then cut your joints. But medieval carpenters routinely cut joints in green wood, timber that had just been felled, sometimes with moisture content above 30%. And their joints didn't fail, they got tighter. Here's the secret. They used a technique where the tenon was made from drier wood, and the mortise was cut in greener wood. As the mortise timber dried and shrank, it clamped down on the tenon like a vise. The joint actually became stronger over time, without a single drop of glue. They called this approach draw boring in English timber framing. They would offset the peg holes in the tenons slightly from the holes in the mortise, then drive a tapered oak peg through both. As that peg was driven home, it pulled the joint tight, and as everything dried together, the whole assembly locked permanently. I tried draw boring on a workbench build about 3 years ago, using white oak pegs about 3/8 of an inch in diameter, and I offset the holes by about 1/16 of an inch. When I drove those pegs in, I could feel the joint cinch up. No clamps needed. That bench hasn't moved a fraction of an inch since. The fourth thing they knew was how to season wood properly, and this is something almost no modern DIYer does well. We either buy kiln-dried lumber and trust that it's ready, or we air dry boards and guess when they are done. Medieval carpenters seasoned timber for specific purposes over specific time frames. Oak for structural framing was often used green, as I just described. But oak for furniture or fine joinery might be air-dried for 2 to 7 years, depending on thickness. They stacked it carefully with stickers, small strips of dry wood between each layer, and they oriented the stack to catch prevailing wind while staying out of direct sun. The key insight is that they understood drying rate matters as much as final moisture content. Dry wood too fast, and the outside shrinks while the inside is still wet, which causes checking, cracking, and internal stress. Medieval craftsmen in England would often store their timber in open-sided barns that allowed airflow, but blocked rain and direct sunlight. The patience involved is something most of us have lost entirely. I'll admit, I've pulled boards off a stack months too early because I was eager to start a project, and I've paid the price every single time. The fifth principle is that medieval carpenters chose specific species for specific jobs, and they were remarkably precise about it. They didn't just grab whatever was available. English oak was the backbone of timber framing because of its strength and durability, but they used elm for applications that needed to resist splitting, like wheel hubs and mallet heads, because elm has an interlocked grain that holds together under impact. They used ash where they needed flexibility and shock absorption, like tool handles and cart frames. Sweet chestnut was used where oak wasn't available because it has similar durability but is lighter. Willow was used for cricket bats and basket weaving because of its lightweight and resilience. Each species was matched to its purpose based on centuries of accumulated knowledge about how that wood performs under specific stresses. Modern DIYers tend to pick wood based on appearance or availability, but if you start thinking about species selection the way a medieval carpenter did, matching the wood's natural properties to the demands of the project, your work will last longer and perform better. The sixth thing they understood was wood movement, and they designed around it instead of ignoring it. This is probably the single biggest source of failure in modern DIY projects. Wood moves. It expands and contracts across the grain with changes in humidity, and it barely moves at all along the grain. Medieval carpenters knew this intimately. When they built a frame, every joint was designed to allow for seasonal movement without losing structural integrity. They never pinned a wide board flat across its grain to a rigid frame the way so many of us do with screws and pocket holes today. When I see a modern tabletop screwed directly to its aprons with no allowance for movement, I know exactly what's going to happen. The top will crack, or it will bow, or it will tear itself away from the base. Medieval craftsmen used floating panels, slotted connections, and elongated peg holes that allowed the wood to breathe. They planned for movement because they knew it was inevitable. The seventh thing is that medieval carpenters achieved surface quality with edge tools, not abrasives. They didn't have sandpaper. What they had were sharp planes, draw knives, and spoke shaves, and they produced surfaces that are genuinely smoother than what most of us achieve with sanding. Here's the science behind it. When you sand wood, you're tearing fibers and leaving a fuzzy, scratched surface at the microscopic level. When you cut wood with a razor-sharp plane iron, you're severing fibers cleanly. The result is a surface that reflects light more evenly, takes finish more uniformly, and actually repels moisture better because the wood cells aren't torn open. I started finishing surfaces with a finely tuned No. 4 smoothing plane about 5 years ago, and I haven't gone back to sanding for final surfaces since. The difference is something you can feel with your hand and see in how the finish looks. The eighth principle is that they used natural finishes that actually protected the wood instead of just sitting on top of it. Medieval craftsmen used linseed oil, beeswax, tallow, and combinations of these to finish their work. What most people don't realize is that raw linseed oil, not the boiled version we buy today, penetrates deeply into wood fibers and polymerizes over time, creating a durable, flexible finish from within. They also used milk paint, made from lime and milk protein, which bonds chemically with the wood surface. These finishes allowed the wood to breathe, which prevented moisture from getting trapped underneath and causing rot. Compare that to a thick coat of polyurethane, which seals the surface but can trap moisture if there's any imperfection in the film, leading to bubbling, peeling, and hidden decay underneath. The ninth thing medieval carpenters knew was how to use layout tools with extraordinary precision. They worked with a scribe, a straight edge, a square, and a set of dividers, and they could lay out complex joinery with remarkable accuracy. The key difference between their approach and ours is that they used direct scribing instead of measuring with numbers. Instead of measuring a mortise at 2 inches wide by 3 inches deep, they would take the actual tenon piece, hold it against the mortise timber, and scribe directly from one to the other. This eliminates the accumulated error that comes from measuring, converting, marking, and then cutting. Every measurement is taken directly from the mating piece. When I started scribing joints directly instead of relying on my tape measure and combination square, my joint fit improved overnight. It sounds almost too simple, but that's exactly why it works. The 10th and final thing they understood is one that might be the most important of all. They knew that skill comes from repetition under guidance, not from buying better tools. The medieval apprenticeship system required 7 years of daily practice under a master craftsman before you were considered qualified. Most of us today watch a 20-minute video and expect to cut dovetails that afternoon. I'm not saying you need a 7-year apprenticeship, but the principle is sound. Slow down. Practice the fundamentals. Cut 50 mortise and tenon joints before you worry about whether your chisel cost $40 or $140. The tool matters far less than the hand that holds it. Now let me share some patterns I've noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that medieval craftsmen handled completely differently. The first pattern is reaching for fasteners instead of joinery. Most of us default to screws and pocket holes because they're fast. But medieval carpenters relied on joints that were self-locking. Wedge tenons, drawboard pegs, dovetails, and lap joints that hold through geometry alone. The result is furniture and structures that can be disassembled and repaired without destroying anything. The second pattern is trusting the label on the lumber. We see kiln-dried and assume it's ready to use, but kiln-dried wood can reabsorb moisture in your garage in a matter of weeks. Medieval carpenters understood that seasoning is a process, not a label, and they accounted for the conditions in which the finished piece would live. The third pattern is sanding everything. We sand because it's easy and it feels productive. But we're often making surfaces worse at a microscopic level. A sharp edge tool does the job better and faster once you develop the skill. The fourth pattern is ignoring species selection. We pick wood because it looks nice, not because its properties match the job. Start choosing species the way a medieval carpenter did, based on strength, flexibility, weight, and durability, and you'll build things that last. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start shifting your approach one project at a time. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is a layout technique I picked up from studying English medieval timber framing, and it has saved me more frustration than almost anything else I've learned. When medieval framers needed to lay out matching joints on two timbers that would connect, they would line both timbers up side by side on trestles and scribe across both pieces at once using a single straight line. This guaranteed that the shoulder of the tenon and the edge of the mortise were referenced from exactly the same mark. No measuring, no transferring numbers, no chance for error to creep in between the two pieces. I started doing this for table and bench construction, lining up the legs and stretchers side by side and marking across all 4 legs in one pass, and my joinery has never fit better. It takes an extra 5 minutes of setup and saves hours of frustration. Before we wrap up, if today's video taught you something new, imagine having 100 techniques like this at your fingertips. That is exactly what the Lost Workshop is. It is my complete guide to medieval hand tool woodworking, all in one place with 17 chapters, 33 illustrations, and 156 pages of clear instructions. You can get your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or using the link in the description. Thanks for being here. Subscribe if you have not yet, and I will see you next time.